I want to thank some really important people. Most important of all is Natalie Unwin-Coroneri and Jessica Sotomayor. I think we can all agree that the SUSDEV program wouldn't work without them, so they've been great. I also want to thank our two wonderful TAs, as usual. I've been blessed basically by having wonderful TAs over the years. Sarah Stender, who's working with me, and Dan Bader, who I work with as well, who's working with Dr. Radley Horton. Radley couldn't make it. He's down at the Conference of the Parties 20, is it? In Lima, Peru right now. Usually scientists don't have much to do there, but those Conference of the Parties. But anyway, I'm sure they're going to flock to him to get some quotes on climate research. So this is a fun day, and I think, by the way, these are going to be short presentations. We have 4, and they're going to be short. And I know my teams have practiced to keep it in 10 minutes, and we have a cane to pull you off if you go over 10 minutes. So I hope you guys have all practiced. And we'll have 5 minutes for questions between these presentations. I would like to ask that after the team has done your presentation, please hang around, don't leave, provide an audience for the rest of the group. I also want to thank Diane Dietrich as well, because she's been a very important contact for us for the West Point teams through the years, and they have been, amazing clients, and we'd like to continue with them as we go forward. Jessica also wanted me to emphasize that when you speak and when you answer questions, please speak into the microphone, because it's being recorded, and if you're standing away, nobody will hear it. And we'd also like to request that after the speakers, who is not usually the full team, are done, that the rest of the team members come up to help answer questions. So come forward and stand up with your teammates. So with that, I'll turn over to the first team, the water availability in the Nile River Basin.
How's everyone doing today? Thanks for coming out. My name's Andrew. This is Maya, Salma. So this semester we worked with Professor Keese at West Point on water availability in the Nile River Basin. And the reason this is important because all types of climate indicators and precipitation indicators indicate that Egypt's likely to face a water-constrained future. So we just wanted to see how resilient Egypt is and different ways that they're going to be able to react to different shocks and stresses to their system. So we looked at 2 critical factors in a resiliency context. They were the electrical system and the agriculture. So we were a smaller group than usual, so we wanted to do more of a qualitative assessment rather than quantitative. So we did a thorough literature review based on resiliency, agriculture, power generation, and we looked into a previously published paper by Hamuda that had 31 vulnerability indicators of water resources within Egypt, and then we context that with our research and under the resiliency context. And previous groups focused on the Nile River Basin as a whole. Our group, we focused more so just on Egypt. So with that, Maya will talk a little bit about resiliency.
Hi everyone, my name is Maya Becker, and so for my part of the project concerned resilience, and this I have some familiarity with. I did a little bit of summer research on resilience and vulnerability. Oops. And so here's just a quick graphic illustrating what we really conceptualize as the definition of resilience in this context. So it was really important that we develop our own sort of definition, just because it's such a buzzword, but there really isn't any universal definition that's been established. And so if you look at this graphic, the green line represents an overall development trend on which a system or entity or person or really anything that could be resilient is functioning. And so the black line represents a sort of more rough, jagged version of that curve. And so it has spikes and dips that ultimately sort of make it a little more interesting. But the resilience of the system is its ability to get back to that overall development trend and sort of restore that sense of normalcy and bounce back. And so key concepts here are vulnerability, shocks and stressors, which are, in our context, are things like droughts and just like decreased precipitation, and then sustainability and system dynamics. And so the second part of my research focused on evaluating vulnerability and resilience. So this is rooted in the concept of you get what you measure. There's no point in making a statement about things like resilience and vulnerability if you can't actually assign some metrics to it. So we looked into what makes a good indicator or index, and then, as Andrew mentioned earlier, we identified a paper by Hamouda and a few colleagues, they're actually from Egypt, that looked at water resource vulnerability in the Eastern Nile Basin. And they looked at all three countries that the Nile primarily runs through, so Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt. And they identified the 31 indicators and split them into 5 categories.
Hi, so I'm going to be focusing on the agricultural sustainability component of the project. In terms of the background, the arable land distribution has a clear concentration along the Nile River Basin, and that can be seen on the map in the green region. And that's also part of the reason why agriculture is almost entirely dependent on irrigation in Egypt. And in terms of the share of the water budget, agriculture is the highest sector with about 81%, as opposed to electricity, for instance, which is only 3%. And Andrew will discuss this further in the energy portion of the project. In terms of the vulnerability, as Maya mentioned, we used Hamouda's paper of the 31 indicators. And for agriculture, we honed down on 3 specific ones, which were irrigation dependence, labor dependence on agriculture, and the percentage usage of fertilizer. All of them showed very high levels of vulnerability, so improving any one of those 3 would improve the overall resilience over time. We also looked at different adaptive agricultural strategies that could be used to help improve this projected future water restraints in Egypt. Some of them ranged from agroecology, agrobiodiversity, low-input agriculture, and many others that we analyzed, but we decided to focus on permaculture because it was a more holistic approach that involved environmental, economic, as well as social benefits. And it's often defined by the Permaculture Research Institute as the conscious design and maintenance of agriculturally productive ecosystems, which have the diversity, stability, and resilience of natural ecosystems. So it's based on imitating nature and adapting to whatever environment it is in. We also looked at a range of water conservation techniques, which varied from compost to mulch in ways that it could reduce the evaporation of water, as well as different irrigation techniques that would either require less water input or less frequent irrigating. And finally, we talked about ways we could diversify crops with less of an emphasis on water-consuming crops. And one of the main crops we focused on was olives because it consumes very little water, and there's a huge growing international market that Egypt could enter.
So as far as power generation goes, I primarily focus on electrical generation. It makes up 20% of Egypt's entire energy budget, and it's actually a very water-intensive process, which people don't realize, primarily through cooling and actual power generation, spinning the turbines. So I wanted to come up with a measure of withdrawals and consumption. So it's real quick. Withdrawals is how much water you're taking out to the system, but it actually ends up going back in. Consumption is how much is actually lost through evaporation, transpiration, et cetera. So you have these systems that some of them are high withdrawal, high consumption. Those are the bad ones, which is hydro. You got steam, though, on the other hand, which is high withdrawal, low consumption, though. So you're putting it back in. So as long as the water is available, that's actually the most efficient system to run in terms of water usage. That's not taking into effect any of the climate change and all that, but just as far as having the water on hand. And this was able to tie back into Hamouda's paper, where one of his indicators was hydropower dependence, where you look at hydropower as a portion of the total energy generated. And he created a threshold of 25%. So as to say, if you're generating 25% of your power through hydropower, you're at risk. In Egypt's case, this isn't a problem. As you can see from the graph, the trend is it's going down now. Their installed capacity continues to increase, but they're meeting their needs through alternative means of production, either through combined cycles, steam, or gas.
Okay, just a quick note about our key findings and avenues for potential for future work. So a big thing that we realized is that while we can draw qualitative conclusions about vulnerability, vulnerability and resilience, while connected, aren't the same thing. And so future work really needs to work on bogging down what resilience means and how we can quantitatively measure that. And so one future step that we identified could be the development of a sort of composite resilience index that incorporated indicators like those put forth by Hamuda and colleagues, but also different and adapted to a more resilience sense of things. And then other avenues that we'd like to explore are the effects and interactions of other energy industries and other sectors on water availability. Thank you. Any questions?
So Professor Keith has been working on this for a while. He's a sociology professor up there, and he's looking at how conflict can arise out of limited water resources. So that's really what it ties into. And the project's been running for a couple years now. So every year he kind of picks and chooses a different aspect that he's looking into. But ultimately, too, I was in the military for a number of years, so I know how policy works with them, and it's very slow to get things going. So the more information you have on anything, the more policy you can eventually implement. So he's just kind of working through the processes of seeing how this all ties back into conflict over there.
We have a microphone, so if you do ask, don't be intimidated if you do ask the question. It's just so we can record it. Jason. Oh, I'm sorry. Students go first. Non-professionals go last. Non-professionals go first.
What are the major factors that you guys identified that influenced the vulnerability amongst communities, and was there much of a difference in the areas that you examined?
So unfortunately, we didn't really have enough time to get into specific community resilience. So we mainly focused on defining resilience and vulnerability in this context. And so all of the 31 indicators that Hamuda put forth, they kind of all address different aspects of, here we can go into the different categories. So there are the geopolitical ones, the hydrophysical, infrastructure, and then sociocultural and economic, and then health and population indicators. So there are 5 or 6 for each of those categories. And we didn't really have enough time to get into what sort of indicators for community health and things like that would be. But that's definitely something that we would have liked to do. Sorry.
Just I want to remind, if there are other members of the team,
This is it.
Yeah.
because I want the full team to get credit, and they help answer questions, but you guys are all okay. Jason.
So I have some crop questions. First of all, this is tangential, but I'm curious to know what's driving the global demand in olive oil besides the fact that it's delicious. Secondly, what are their primary crops, and how many of those, to what degree are those crops exported or imported within Egypt?
Well, actually, 40% of the agriculture in Egypt is dependent on 4 crops solely, which are very water intensive, and they're tomato, maize, wheat, and beets. And that's why one of our main recommendations was to increase crop rotation and diversification towards less water-intensive crops. And in terms of olives, we found that it was one of the 4 crops that consume the least water. And in terms of the international market, we focused on one of the papers that showed that in Europe, there was an increase of magnitude of about 200 to 300% since the 1990s of consumption of olive oil. And also some of the non-traditional olive oil consumers, such as the US, the UK, and Japan, entered the market. And so we thought that Egypt could join its neighboring countries and increase that market.
Do you know if climate change is impacting crops elsewhere? I mean, as much as it's a water-resilient crop, is it being impacted by climate change elsewhere in some of the traditional olive oil production areas?
Well, we didn't really analyze other countries except for Egypt, but I'm guessing that in Northern Africa, for sure, like Tunisia and Morocco, that those are issues, and some of the Mediterranean regions such as Italy or Spain, who are some of the top olive oil producers, and that's mainly because of the increase in temperature and some of the dry lands.
You know, these questions are this is the most important part of of today, by the way, because these students will all be going to their clients' offices next week. They'll be going to West Point, my teams, and they'll be getting much tougher questions. So this is a warm-up. So try to ask them a tough question if you can. Anyone?
Oh yeah, I guess. Do you guys was there any discussion about like salinity, like issues with the water withdrawals that they have, or do they not have those problems there?
To be honest, that wasn't something that we really considered, and thank you for that, because I think that would be a pretty important consideration. I don't really know. I'm not an agricultural expert like Selma is, but I don't really know what sort of effects water salinity has on crops. Sorry.
Wait, I'm sorry, what did you mean by the salinity impact on the agriculture, or just general?
No, I saw like one of your suggestions for increasing adaptations and stuff was the drip agriculture.
Drip irrigation, yeah.
And I just saw that they had issues with, I guess, like salt blocking up the line. So I was wondering if that was something that Egypt had, experienced. Or...
Yeah, they actually didn't, it wasn't one of the main irrigation systems that has been used, but that's why we thought that there should be a combination between night and gradual irrigation, because that would reduce the number of water that is required in the irrigation systems. And also training plants was one of the main recommendation, because it makes them more drought tolerant over time. And so that was what we looked into.
How much did the pollution of the water impact your recommendations in your study? Did you find that that was a major issue or not?
No, it wasn't. The main issue was the projected decline in water due to climate change, and the pollution is actually not the main factor that is going to impede agriculture and the food shortage over time, but rather the fact that there's very little rainfall and increases in temperature.
It's actually really interesting. Of the world's 19 major rivers, you'd think that the Nile would be pretty much up there in terms of stream flow. It's ranked 16th, and that's at the river mouth. And so rivers like the Amazon and the Congo and the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, they have experienced much higher stream flow. And the Nile is a very culturally important river, and it's the longest river in the world, but it doesn't really have very much stream flow, and that's only expected to decrease with climate change.
Did you look into aquaponics for the agricultural use?
No, we did not. That was not one of the main strategies we looked into, but it's very interesting, and that could be used for the future study.
Anyone have one last quick question? Okay. Thank you guys for staying on schedule.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Vogt, and these are my fellow group members, Sam and Phil. And today we will talk to you about New York State utilities and the impact of climate change on resilience. So to give you a little overview, I'm going to discuss the climate projections for New York State, as well as the impact for utility infrastructure. Then Sam will highlight the various different utility companies that we researched for this project, and Phil will take it away with policy implications and future work.
Okay, and just to begin with a little bit of context for our project, so the Public Service Commission, which we'll call the PSC from now on, is a statewide body that regulates all utility companies in New York State. This regulation usually takes the form of a rate case, and that's what the scope of what our project was in. In these rate cases, a company will provide financial information and any other supporting documents as to why they should be allowed to increase their rates, change their rates, and recoup their investments. Specifically, in 2013, Con Ed was up for a rate case. Michael Gerard and the Saban Center over at the law school intervened in this case, seeking to use climate projections, mostly put together by the Climate report by a couple of our colleagues here at Columbia, and they eventually agreed on a settlement for $1 billion of investment in storm hardening and resiliency over 3 years. And this proceeding has served as a model for our work here this semester. This outcome from a legal perspective is ideal for us because it isn't focused on one specific improvement, but rather using these projections to inform long-term planning and increase our practical solutions.
So as Phil previously stated, our client for this project was the Saban Center for Climate Change Law here at Columbia. And so our main objective was to provide background information as to what other utility companies are doing in terms of resilience to projected climate change. So the report that we used for our climate projections was responding to climate change in New York State. This is also known as Climate. This report was funded by NYSERDA, and it was developed by 3 universities, by Columbia University, Cornell, and the City Colleges of New York. It used 35 different climate projection models and 2 greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So what it did is it divided New York State into 7 different regions. This is very important because New York State is very diverse, so the different regions have different threats in terms of projected climate change. And so the various different utility companies that we used, they bordered different regions, and this allowed us to identify localized vulnerabilities based on region. While I won't discuss climate change projections based on the 7 regions, I'll talk about some general trends for New York State. So temperature by 2020 may increase 1.5 to 3 degrees. In terms of average precipitation, it may increase 1 to 8%. In terms of rising sea level, this may increase 3 to 8 inches, and we may have more frequent heat waves, coastal flooding, and heavy rain events. So this has very important implications in terms of utility infrastructure because our current infrastructure may not be able to handle these projected changes. To give a few examples in terms of temperature, equipment such as power lines and transformers are rated to handle a certain temperature, and with increasing temperature, they may overheat and cause system failure. In terms of an increase of average precipitation, this may cause increased flooding of critical electric equipment, and this could also result in malfunction. And even increase in high winds and ice and snowstorms, it could cause power lines to come down and result in brownouts and blackouts like we saw in Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Irene. So now I'm going to pass it on to Sam, who will discuss the different utility companies that we researched. So take it away, Sam.
Great. Okay. So of course, a large portion of our research was focused on the utility providers themselves and how they plan to combat climate change and enact resiliency measures. So we focused on 5 utilities in our study, and those happen to be Central Hudson, National Grid, Peace-Ag Long Island, New York State Electric and Gas, and Rochester Gas and Electric. And then just to do the analysis, we created a 5-point research framework, which just involves a background of the company, which highlights the key vulnerabilities, past damages and failures, as well as future plans and an overarching analysis. And just to visualize that analysis a little bit better, we created a chart which highlights some of the key concerns and then also some of the actions and initiatives that the utilities are taking to combat these concerns. So as you can see, almost every utility provider in this scenario is concerned with flooding, extreme winds, and emergency and demand management. And the ways in which they combat these concerns are specifically tailored to the regions that they are in, as highlighted by the Climate report that Michelle was talking about earlier. So we basically looked into 3 underlying themes in our study, and I'll just go through them one by one. And the first one being, well, most utility providers have the capacity to enact resiliency measures. Oftentimes they had no incentives to do so. So I focused a lot on National Grid in particular, and they operate half in the US and half in the UK. So when you look at the operations in the UK, they work in step with the national government there, so much so that they have resiliency plans up into 2080, which really contrasts what they do in the US. So I think oftentimes it all depends on the state-by-state cases, and they usually plan ahead maybe 10 to 15 years, which I think really highlights the sort of proactive stance that utilities have taken in other countries, especially with nationalized governments, as compared to sort of state-by-state reactive sort of measures that they're taking in the U.S. Additionally, we found that most utility providers have been focusing on outward images rather than substantial analysis. And I think thinking back to the Central Hudson webpage, the first three words you see on the site are smarter, better, and stronger. And it doesn't really go into detail much further as to what they really plan on doing in terms of like a really substantial sort of analysis. And that's something that we really saw in a lot of the utility providers. Additionally, we saw that outside organizations played a very big role in highlighting some of the vulnerabilities of the utilities themselves. So we looked into the Moreland Commission on utility storm preparedness, which was done in the wake of a lot of extreme weather events in the New York region over the past 2 or 3 years. And we saw that the study allowed us to see like 5 key weaknesses in each utility, and it oftentimes allowed us to get details that the utilities would not easily disclose themselves. So with that, I'll hand it off to Phil, who will talk about the policy implications and some of our future work.
Okay, so procedurally, within the rate case structure that we discussed earlier, there are 2 main forms of effective action that we can pursue. The first is to directly intervene. That's what you see on the left here. A group such as the Saban Center can gain party status, which would allow them to submit testimony, answer the company's testimony, cross-examine witnesses, and eventually actually bargain for an agreement such as the one that Mike procured with Con Ed in 2013. The alternative is to seek a declaratory ruling based upon that same Con Ed case. There was a mandate within the final order of that said that there's an obligation to address these climate concerns that should be broadened to include all utilities. So with the first, we have the problem of a group such as the Saban Center has to actually directly intervene in each and every company's case. There are about 3 to 4 major rate cases a year, and the result is there needs to be a lot of manpower and a lot of direct focus on this to achieve the same change that a declaratory ruling could achieve just exactly once. So while that mandate's in place, it actually needs to be underlined in a sense so that these companies are actually forced to address it and move forward with these changes. So our work as the undergrad team specifically, we focused on the Central Hudson case, which is ongoing, and that the Saban Center is a current party in. Michelle and Sam discussed the research that we did for that. We also helped compose Dr. Radley Horton's expert testimony that was submitted 2 weeks ago on that, and hopefully our outcome here will be similar to the Con Ed case. But now that the research is done, the law team is continuing with that work. There's going to be rebuttal testimony soon, followed by hopefully a similar outcome later. And then there are a couple of rate cases coming up in the immediate future. Specifically, the next major rate case will begin in the spring, where they can hopefully achieve a declaratory ruling, and that'll be with National Grid. But even if all that goes perfectly, these are just a few companies in one state. And the effects of climate change, as we know, spread far beyond us here in New York. So as utility companies around the country deal with these same problems, the work that the Saban Center is doing in pursuing this has been extremely proactive and perhaps unique in the U.S., as states have tended to deal with these threats to their infrastructure haphazardly and only in the wake of disasters and crises, which is exactly what we did here in the wake of Sandy, but hopefully we've taken it one step farther. And by doing that and using these projections to plan for the future, we have the chance to deliver a practical solution to these 2 real problems that hopefully can be taken nationwide. So thank you. We have a few acknowledgements for our wonderful client that we have the privilege of working with and our advisors, Radley and Dan. So thank you.
My question is, what were the sources of information you used to identify the company's strategy and goals, given that it's usually, undisclosed information, private to managers only?
So in a few instances, I guess, so what we did is we had people working on specific companies. So when I looked at National Grid, they actually were pretty willing to work with third parties. So I think I found a few interesting studies, one from C2ES, which talked about what they were going to do in the UK. I think it was a little more difficult to figure out what they would do in the U.S., especially just based on what they would show, just as disclosed on the website alone. But if you looked at the New York State Public Service Commission and what they were doing through that, oftentimes you could see some of what they planned on doing in the future. Does that answer your question?
Do you guys see a resiliency measure that is more achievable than some of the others? And also, I'd like you to comment specifically on the likelihood of some of these companies actually burying the transmission lines, which seems to have been a significant challenge in some of the ways in which the grid was affected in the last couple of storms.
Specifically with undergrounding, we didn't focus on that in New York State. We saw a lot of that in Florida, but there wasn't a particular initiative here that focused on that. I know it has a big impact, but most of what we've seen has been vegetation management in the mid-Atlantic region. And as to your first question was what exactly, Jason?
Do you see any other resiliency measures that are maybe low-hanging fruit or more achievable, or there's more stomach for them than others?
It seems like the most immediate concern, especially here in New York, is flooding. And so I think that's what the Con Ed case focused on. Dr. Horton and Mike Gerard just showed the climate projections to the Con Ed engineers, and they were like, wow, this is like, we obviously need to be planning for this. And that seemed to be the main driver in that, just the actual sea level rise and the impact of these storms. It seems like that's going to be the focus in the coming years.
Just to add to the undergrounding, it's extremely expensive. So I think a lot of them have been focused on maybe raising the power lines instead of putting them underground.
Do you think that plays out if you do the full cradle to grave analysis on it? I mean, if you look at the maintenance of vegetation and the damage caused over time relative to undergrounding, do you believe that it's still more expensive to bury transmission lines over the maintenance that goes into it?
So we kind of. There isn't actually a lot of research out there on the costs. So that's one part of, I guess, the future work that we highlighted in our paper was that we really have to look at a cost-benefit analysis in terms of specific actions taken.
The focus of my research was PSCG Long Island, and the cost to underground there has been estimated at about $1 billion. So really, the discussion has stopped there in that region.
My question is around, did you look at all into, or do you have to confront the problem of like who would pay for this if those measures were taken? Would it be the utility, or are there like state subsidies, and because that obviously if those investments would change the rate base of the utilities and therefore change their revenues, and so I was wondering if you looked into that at all.
Sure, it certainly impacts the rate base, and the utility is going to have to bear the cost eventually. But really the purpose behind our project is to say this is what you need to be planning for, rather than a historical 100-year storm or the past climate. And really, while there will be a probable increase, even though there wasn't with the Con Ed case due to some financial wrangling, the point is to spread that increase in cost over the next 20, 30 years, whatever the long-term plan is, rather than have a major crisis force the company, and that way the taxpayers or the ratepayers to bear that cost all at once through like a Sandy Lake storm.
Prior to the rate case, was there just a complete absence of a resiliency plan, or was there a resiliency plan that wasn't being implemented, or what was the case there? I guess specifically to Con Ed, I mean, did they have plans to increase the resiliency of the infrastructure, and those plans just weren't being followed through with, or?
Right. So all these companies have future plans for their infrastructure, but our focus is what projections are informing that. So in the past, they've used historical data. The 100-year storm, I think, is something that most people are familiar with as like what we need to prepare for going forward. And so they have those plans, but maybe they're not to the intensity that they need to be. They're not realizing the threats that are coming, and because they aren't utilizing current climate projections and realizing the change that is happening.
Great, thank you guys.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Grant Gutierrez, and this is my teammate Fabio de Souza. And this semester, we've been doing a kind of a data collection project on tracking kind of the effectiveness of a cool roof technology in New York City. So our client this semester was the Office of the Mayor, particularly the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. I see you can't see the long for some reason. But the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability kind of works within this Plan NYC initiative, which is the sustainability schematic for New York City in the kind of coming decades as we think about climate change and global warming. Within this initiative, we have the NYC Cool Roofs Project. So the NYC Cool Roofs Project is an aim to coat roof surfaces throughout the city with white. And there are kind of various technologies that exist, and the way that NYC Cool Roofs does it is with this white acrylic paint. And so why they use this acrylic paint, there's three reasons. One is because it's a retrofit option. So you can go to any building in the city and lay down this paint. Two, it's pretty cost effective. It's about 50 cents a square foot. And three, it's user-friendly. So we had some of our volunteers or people on our team this semester, Theo went with one of our other teammates and actually did the painting themselves with Sustainable South Bronx. And the coating takes place in all 5 boroughs, as you can see, and they do about 1 million square feet a year, which seems like an impressive number. But if you think about the landscape of roof square footage in New York City, it's 1 billion square feet. So 1 billion square feet over 1 million square feet a year is 1,000 years. So this technology isn't something that the NYC Cool Roofs Initiative is really trying to do throughout the whole city. Actually, the buildings that they've been working on have mainly been city buildings. What they're trying to do is kind of use us and use the program as a pilot program to show how that this can be implemented by private owners, building owners, landlords, that type of thing. So the client came to us with a couple questions and wanted us to kind of figure out how we can use our data to best reflect the questions that they've been encountered with and kind of the challenges they've been confronting. So the first question is, what are the surface types or the temperatures across various surface types? So on the roof, you have the whiteness that was laid down, and that's pretty obvious. In some of the roofs, we have a black asphalt. And then there are some other areas on the roof where, because the roofs are uneven and over the years, after it rains, a soil deposition will collect into these kind of sunken areas in the roof, and then we call it ponding area. So we had 4 different surface types across 3 locations. The 3 locations were 135th Street Precinct over there in Harlem, the 35th Street Precinct, and the 38th Street Toe Pound. The second question that came to us was, how does aging affect cool roof performance? So as you see over the years, the oldest, I think, roof we were doing is 2 years old, and then the youngest was 1 year. And over the years, because of the pollution in New York City air, you see the white roof lose some of its brilliance. And so the white starts to turn to this kind of faded off-white or gray. So the idea is to see what does aging, how does that affect kind of this albedo effect, which is given from the white roof, and how can we kind of think around that. The third question was, is the winter heat penalty an issue, and how can we easily explain the answer, right? So a cool roof technology uses something that's albedo, and albedo is a number between 1 and 0, 1 being black, 0 being black, 1 being white, that tracks outgoing radiation over incoming radiation. So the effect is, okay, hopefully that a cool roof makes the building cooler. But some of the clients and some of the people that the Office of the Mayor were interacting with was, okay, if it makes it cooler, then in the winter are we suffering a penalty? Is it actually too cold? So we've been trying to figure out how to kind of explain that, think through that concept, and that's something Fabio will talk about later. And then the last question was, what are the potential costs, benefits, and challenges of maintaining such a technology? So costs and benefits, we were looking into something such as doubling the roof life. So does this technology, through kind of reducing the exposure to sunlight, increase the roof life? Another kind of question of maintaining, it would be, for example, cleaning it. So we'll talk about that later. If you clean the grayness, you clean the dirt off, does it, increase its brilliance? So here you can see a picture of the surface types like I was describing earlier. On the left, you see the fresh, which was laid down this summer. It's a 10 by 10 patch. Right next to it, you see on the same picture the age surface. So you can definitely see a pretty stark difference. And that is a picture from a roof that's only a year old. Then you see a picture of the ponding. So that's the area where the soot collects. And then the black asphalt. And so the asphalt is pretty much what's on most of the roofs in New York City right now. So those are the surface types we were looking at on the different locations, like I said. And now Fabio is going to kind of go into our findings, the data we're doing, and some of the recommendations we have.
Hi, everyone. I'm Fabio De Souza. First of all, Professor Gaffin had a team working on these roofs over the summer, and that's where you see the most drastic differences. And they even carry on into September. So you see on a sunny day there, we've got the exposed asphalt, which is most roofs being about 50 degrees hotter than the fresh coating. We do see the temperature increasing for aged coating relative to fresh coating. And then the ponding area is a little more, but all of those relative to the exposed asphalt are, it's night and day. Over there you see the Central Park air temperature. So a day around 70 degrees, the exposed asphalt is reaching 130 on a sunny day. So right there you can see that this is very effective in the summer. Because the winter months aren't quite done yet, we're using cloudy days as proxies, because on a cloudy day there's less sunlight coming in. The high albedo roof technology works by reflecting sunlight, so less sunlight, less reflected sunlight, less of an effect. And so here you can see on a cloudy day this all flattens out pretty much. Still around 70 degrees, only difference is, more clouds. Everything is roughly the same, especially relative to the differences seen before. Now, one of the things the Office of the Mayor asked us to do is to find a way to communicate why the winter heat penalty isn't as serious as it's thought to be. And so, on a cloudy day, there's less sunlight. In the winter, sunlight's hitting New York at its altitude or at its latitude less directly than in the summer, which means, for all intents and purposes, that the same amount of energy is getting spread out over a larger area. And our initial findings are from our readings taken in November are helping us support this. And this is actually the presentation form of a physical collateral that the Office of the Mayor can use to take to their potential clients. And as far as cleaning is concerned, we decided to use water and house wash using some scrub brushes to clean patches of the aged surface to look at maintenance, because the high albedo coating loses half of its albedo over 2 years, and that could be even faster in a polluted area like New York. So we see here that with the cleaning, it kind of starts restoring it to the fresh coating. And when I say fresh coating, I mean about a 4-month-old coating. So, and using the cleaner, we actually improved the performance relative to the fresh coating that was laid down only a few months ago. On this particular day, the ponding was frozen over, so we couldn't trust those measurements. And what this shows is that the maintenance, just using water or a very cheap house wash, which is about 400 square feet per dollar, you can keep the brilliance up and have everything working. As far as our cost-benefit analysis, we are using a fact promoted by the manufacturers of the coating that it can double or even triple roof life. This happens because by reducing the expansion and contraction cycles that the roof goes because of changes in temperature, the roof material lasts longer. So we took the cost of replacing a roof 20 years in the future, tracked that back because money now is more precious to us than money in the future. And we looked at a variety of discount rates ranging from the EPA, which values the future more than the market. And what you see is that there is a savings just from looking at the roof life alone, which is important for our client because looking at just the energy savings isn't convincing enough for a lot of people. So once we start adding in these other benefits, such as roof life, and then later on reduction in the urban heat island effect, makes their argument more convincing and makes it more likely that private owners will decide to install this on their own. And that's it. The rest of our team can join us.
Yeah.
Jeremy. Yeah. And you can.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is Theo Hilton, and this is Jeremy Mouliez.
Did you guys look into the projected lifespan of the paint without the cleaning and compared it sort of to cleaning costs and see what is more efficient? Maybe the paint lasts 20 years and it's still efficient, or maybe it only lasts 3 years. Or what was the span that you looked at?
As far as the life of the paint itself, these roofs haven't been down on the roofs long enough for us to really know. But we do know that they do lose half of their albedo in about 2 years. So we are looking at what we're trying to do is find out like the energy savings of cleaning the roof, if that's greater than the cost of it, and it's hard to tell right now, just because we're going up on these roofs twice a week for the semester. The data just isn't there yet for us to know that, but it's something that we're trying to look into moving forward.
Do you know anything about the longevity of the other cool roof options, like compared to the white acrylic paint?
Yeah, that's not something we looked into. So another option is kind of this membrane that gets stretched over the roof, but we haven't looked into that because it actually takes professional installation and it's more expensive. So that's something I did not factor into our analysis. But thank you, that's a good question.
Oh, I'm sorry, did you have a question? Yeah. You get an award if you ask a question for every talk.
That's what my professor told us. So.
Extra good.
So I two questions. Just one, do you know if the formula have the makers of this white acrylic paint, has the formula changed since 2009, since this program started?
And then you said you have a second question? We'll try to address it.
So my second question is a little disconnected, but my second question would be, does the mayor's office or the city government have any plans on trying to promote this, the adoption of cool roof technology through some kind of policy initiative? And are they going to use some of your findings to help support their...
All right. As far as the formula is concerned, we don't think so. As far as there hasn't been like a major change or improvement in the technology. As far as promoting the policy, I know that at least in many cases going forward, when you replace your roof, the city makes you put down the coating. So that's a little bit of the stick portion, but we're trying to show that there are a lot of carrots as well.
Yeah, there's also new codes that require you to, because white roofing, professional white roof membranes are the same cost now as a traditional dark one. So there are codes that now require you to put in a white roof, a flat white roof in many cases. And there are many paints available, so there are competing products. So there could be many studies on which one is the most effective, but they're just starting right now. Diane.
Hello, Diane Dietrich, Department of Environmental Science at Barnard. Having been a previous homeowner over the past number of years, I've had to paint my house. My concern about that is, at the start, is how much is it going to cost me to paint it after how many years? And I know with a house, it's kind of like about 10 years if you're lucky. If the albedo effect is lost after 2 years, 50% is lost after 2 years, that would mean in the next 2 years, it's half of 50%. It seems like the effect that you're going for is lost very quickly, and the cost of keeping up the 100% value on that, it seems to me that it would be really quite expensive to do that. And also another thing I was thinking is that they would have to be roofs that one that you don't walk on also. So it'd have to be rather selective because that would further deteriorate the roof, in addition to weathering and acid rain and all of the other things that air pollution brings to a flat surface.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for your question. A couple of answers that come to mind. One with regard to just the long-term savings aspect of it. If you take into account that you would be saving on your energy bill, so that you already are at a net gain for doing that. So think of it economically, I guess. But also, the coding that we're looking at is actually you could put it on a roof that you could walk on, no problem. And the roofs that, like all the roofs that we're out taking data on, there are these flat roofs that are just asphalt with like this. With the acrylic coating just right on top of them. So they're very easy to clean. And that's one thing that we've been sort of looking into and that there's not a lot of data about is just like what the cost is and like what the work is to do it. So say you're a homeowner, you've got a roof surface that's, likely much smaller than the size of this room, say, and if you had like a water and a push broom kind of scrubbing device, like that would help get some of the dirt off. Maybe a lot of the dirt off. Like the two kinds of cleaning that we did, one was just with water and a scrub brush, and that got it just about back to like on the old, like the stuff that had been coated 2 years before, it got it back to the state of a few months before, and then with soap, it got it back to essentially pristine. So it's something that's pretty easy to do on your own, and if you have a small surface area, we're sort of saying that it wouldn't be too hard. And if you had a pressure washer, that's something that we're really curious about, is you could just go up there. Spray it off, like no big deal. So there are, I think it's a legitimate concern, but there are pretty easy ways to address it. And also, it's an interesting question that I'm also would like to learn more about. And I don't think the data is out there for like past 2 years. If that effect continues at the same rate. If it will continue to get, lose its, by 10 years, it's essentially gone. Like I don't know if that would actually be the case.
I just want to say quickly that surprisingly, most of the studies show that after about 3 years, albedo is sort of maxed out. I mean, it's minimized out. It doesn't really deteriorate exponentially. So, and even with that loss, it's still performing quite well compared to the asphalt.
So what you're saying is that when it's scrubbed off, and when you do scrub it, it does retain some of its effectiveness.
Yes, from the data we've been seeing has been, yeah.
But I don't have a quick question. I guess I have two questions. Quickly, I understand this for small buildings, but as far as the actual energy savings, it seems like it would be very dependent on the size of the building, the insulation of the roof, et cetera. And how, for a given building, say 10 stories high, how much is the actual savings relative to the total cost of energy for the building? It seems to me like this would be a small fraction of the total energy cost.
So the way we've looked at energy savings is we looked at a study that showed the energy savings range from $10 to $100 per 100 meters squared, which we then took out to look at per square foot, and then we basically were asked by the mayor's office to look at 5,000 square feet building or more, because they're coating big buildings. And the energy savings, when you look at that, yes, they're relatively small, but they do far outweigh over 20 years the cost of actually coating the roof. So if anything, just the energy savings themselves make coating the roof and the cost of coating the roof, paid for in the energy savings. So yes, they're small relative to, for example, the doubling of roof lifetime, but they are there and they do make up for the cost of coating the roof in the first place.
Okay, great. That's great. So the only follow-up question that I have is that I've always understood this more in terms of the potential for reducing urban heat island effects and the more sort of aggregate impacts on an urban environment. If you painted all of the roofs in New York City, what's the sense of how that would impact things like temperature extremes?
So the study that we found from Sustainable South Bronx showed that it would decrease average summer temperature by 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's if you coat the whole of New York City. That's going to be in a while, but that's what the study said. And we used that basically to include some of the benefits that you'd get, such as health improvements. So for example, we looked at how many deaths you get from heat-related illnesses and how decreasing the temperatures by 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit would have a benefit to New York in fewer deaths. And we tried to value that. And it's relatively small, but there's other factors that we're going to continue to include, like, greenhouse gases and a bunch of other factors that we haven't included yet, but we're doing.
We're out of time, but I just want to quickly say you've asked the $64,000 question, what will it do to the climate of New York City? We're hoping that we're talking about something like 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit cooling, which is a lot in climate speak. I think more closer to 1, but remember, this is the size of a borough in terms of aggregate roof area. So we're hoping 1 degree Fahrenheit, but when you compare that to climate projections, that's a pretty big bite. Thank you, guys. Perfect. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Charlotte Bloody, and this is Allie Bowman. And we're going to try to give you a little bit of an insight into what we've been working on this semester for the military. So our initial concept of this project from Lieutenant Mark Smith was just that Camp Buckner and West Point Academy were looking to achieve net zero energy at their training facilities. What status they were in this project or where this was motivated or where it was coming from in the first place was something that we weren't really too sure about before we made our first visit. So we made sure we got to West Point right away. We visited West Point in the beginning of September, and Lieutenant Mark Smith met us with multiple different stakeholders in the process at West Point, and they walked us around the campus and sort of gave us an overview of what we would be working on this semester. So what we realized was that the scope of our project was actually pretty immense. It's something that the Army has never really done before within at least the West Point campuses, which was an initiative to achieve net zero energy, water, and waste at their training facilities. The status of the camp as is now is pretty archaic, and one of the notions of our project is to really get to know the camp as it exists today and evaluate different housing units that we could impose in order to help them achieve net zero energy in the future. After our first meeting with the West Point colonels, we realized that we had quite a few requirements to fill in order for the camp to keep operating as is and achieve energy efficiency. So on the left, you can see some of the requirements that we've been considering for the semester, which is the fact that it must bill at 1,600 cadets a summer. They must be able to winterize them, easy to maintain. These barracks are unoccupied 9 months of the year because it is a summer training facility. They must be air-conditioned bunk or single beds. They must utilize non-combustible materials or equipment and have minimum 2 means of egress. And although these requirements are pretty black and white, the status of the camp being facility as is now and also the suggested alternatives really wasn't very black and white. So that was the scope of our project this semester, was evaluating exactly what we were going to suggest for a renovation of the camp. In order to conceptualize how to approach this massive problem, we went to the Army Sustainability Report to see what their foundations on the idea of net zero energy really were stemming from. And given the beginning nature of the project, we wanted to focus the majority of our semester on energy reduction and efficiency. We've really realized that we wouldn't really have the time to suggest the exact implementation of barracks and the exact measures for renewables to be conducted at Camp Buckner, but what we wanted to do was to get them to the point where they would be ready to do that themselves. So this is a graph sort of outlining that mentality that we focused our semester around. So where they're at right now is point 1, which is basically their base case. They're pretty inefficient buildings. Our job this semester was to really move them along that green line to point 3, in which the buildings would be more energy efficient and they would be not wasting as much energy as they were previously, because if we stepped in at point 1 and offered some renewable options for them, they would really just be producing way more renewables than would be necessary for the campsite. So given the huge scope of our project, we realized that we needed to divide these tasks into separate teams. One of our teams is an energy efficiency team, which was focused on the baseline buildings as is today and sort of recognizing what we were going to compare our alternatives against. Our second team is a housing team, which was responsible for the evaluation of expeditionary housing units to be implemented at Camp Buckner. And our third team is a facilities/logistics team, which has really been the fundamental part of pulling all of this together, because we can look at all these things on paper, but figuring out if they could actually happen at West Point and Camp Buckner was a pretty difficult process. So one of the major issues with our project in the beginning was figuring out how to analyze the current facilities. As you can see, they are not very energy efficient or innovative whatsoever. They were built in the 1960s, and a lot of the information we were going off of was some very limited floor plans that were missing pages, had numbers and units white out. Some of the information we got from the facilities manager, such as the insulation used in these buildings, upon a second site visit, we recognized to be completely false. So Gabby and I's job this semester was to really evaluate these from different types of efficiency measures, such as roof insulation, wall insulation, infiltration, windows, lighting, and the current HVAC system. And what we found was that these facilities, given their status of energy inefficiency, really didn't make much sense to retrofit them because the cost of retrofitting the buildings themselves really was going to outweigh the benefits of doing so, rather than suggesting an alternative housing unit to be implemented within West Point. We came to this conclusion basically because of the horrible status of the buildings themselves. It would take a lot of renovation and a lot of intervention. As you can see by this chart, the Camp Buckner current conditions are on the far left. The barracks upgrade program, which we're comparing it to, is a general Army upgrade initiative that happens, I think it's around 20 years after Army barracks have been built. And they try to achieve some level of efficiency in that. And then the ASHRAE standards, which are on the far right, are basically the standards for any building that's going to claim to be energy efficient. As you can see, just looking at the roof insulation, the first part of our graph right there, there's pretty much no exterior insulation and only an R level of 3 on the roof at the current facilities. The barracks upgrade program recommends an R level of 30 and the ASHRAE standards to be considered energy efficient an R level of 55. So just to see the scope of the amount of inefficiency that we're starting with and where we need to get sort of gives you some perspective into why we felt that some ulterior expeditionary housing would be better housing options for the West Point facilities, especially because what we've realized from Colonel Mark Smith is this isn't just an effort for West Point themselves to save money. This is really a giant Army initiative in which they want to demonstrate their commitment to innovation. So they're willing to consider some really interesting ulterior housing options in order to sort of make a statement and do something that's never really been done before. So Allie's going to talk you through the different expeditionary housing options that we considered.
So when we first went on our site visit, they gave us some suggested expeditionary units. 2 of these were rigid wall shelters and keep shelters. The issue we found with these, though, is that they were all built and designed to work for a 150-person base camp through the Army Net Zero initiative. They've been working only on the 150-person scale. So while both of these options were highly energy efficient, and they would have been great for the camp, they were really expensive and not at the scale that we needed them. So after working with different manufacturers and talking through the logistics, we were able to rule these out. So the 2 options that we focused on were SIP huts and sage shelters. Essentially, both of these are just a different type of panel. The SIP panel is mostly wood, and the sage is the same insulation with metal structure on either side. And the nice part about these, they had been used in expeditionary units. You can see the SIP on the left is actually at West Point now, and the sage was used on the 150-person camp basis. But we were able to work with manufacturers to make a permanent option for these, and we can build them in any design that we want to the camp specifications or to the logistics that we needed. So we worked extensively with manufacturers that West Point had worked with in the past to make our recommendations based off of these. But overall, our recommendations for the project, we, like Charlotte said, were able to rule out a retrofit option or a no change option because they weren't energy efficient and they wouldn't bring us where we needed to be. The facilities team, well, we decided to move the bathrooms and the hygiene facilities out of the current barracks into a separate building so that we wouldn't have to winterize the barracks that were made out of SIP or sage materials. So we would have the SIP or sage barracks for the housing, and then we would have a separate rigid wall shelter hygiene facility because while those were too expensive to use for barracks, they worked well for just doing hygiene. And then to make the new buildings, we could utilize the current foundations that the existing barracks stand on and make new buildings off of those. I don't know if at the very beginning we had other considerations, and one of the big ones was increasing the square footage per cadet. Currently, they're around 50 square feet per cadet, but they needed to be at 75. So we will have to make an additional 16 barracks, and we're planning on building those on current basketball and tennis court locations. And finally, the facilities team has been looking into renewable energy options, such as a floating photovoltaic system on the lake next to Camp Buckner. But yeah, overall, those are our recommendations. Any questions?
Hey, yeah, I have just more of a kind of qualitative question about speculative insight. What was it like working with the military, and what do you think are the ethical and political possibilities for using more of this massive defense budget for kind of climate response policies and climate response changes?
Actually, we were really encouraged to find that the Army itself, and especially the people that we worked with at Camp Buckner, are considering this project not just for their own financial benefits, but because they're really committed to sustainability in the Army and sort of providing groundbreaking research, and also some examples such as at Camp Buckner, they want to use this as a basis to say, look, this is what we've done here, this is what could be done elsewhere. And so we were actually really excited to see that they were way more committed to this than we actually thought they were going to be. We thought this was going to be sort of a, okay, sustainable development, we know that you guys are interested in that, but how do we save money, or how do we stop consuming so much energy because that's what we're supposed to do? It was really more of any opportunity that we saw for energy savings, they were really excited about. They weren't as worried about costs as we originally thought. They really wanted us to go to the full extent that we thought was necessary, and then maybe they were thinking of reining us in if we were spending too much of their money or it wouldn't get approved. But working with them was actually really exciting, especially for the future of these kind of initiatives, because I think they're a great example of the Army outlook as a whole. If you read their sustainability report, they're looking to do this in a lot of other places. So I think what was exciting for our team was the fact that we're not only working for West Point. West Point's really using what we have been suggesting this semester in order to use it as an exemplary case of how the rest of the Army can sort of pursue these endeavors themselves. So to us, it seems like regulatory policy, obviously that's always up in the air because it comes from the big guys, but at the more individual level, it is something that everybody's really committed to, and at least at West Point, and it seems they encompass the idea of the rest of the Army. For example, they're bringing some really great stakeholders to our meeting next week to be confirmed, but it's people from like pretty high up. We're not just presenting this to people at West Point. It's something that the Army feels they all have a large stakeholder in, so it's something we're really excited about.
I just want to, before we take a second question, net zero anything, if I understand your question, net zero anything is the ultimate climate policy as far as I'm concerned. That's what we're heading towards in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So, anyway, Steve.
Thanks. Thanks for your presentation. Where will the cadets play basketball and tennis? I think, yeah.
Well, actually, currently, right now, the basketball courts are being utilized for modular housing. So they're currently not in use at all. And judging by the state of the tennis courts, I don't think anybody has played tennis on them ever. So luckily for us, it looks like they're able to work with us in terms of. The deal with Camp Buckner is because of the location, it's very hard to find flat ground, and the basketball and tennis courts, obviously, they provide a great foundation to just put these new ulterior housing units on, and luckily for us, they're not in use right now, so we're lucky. Yeah, exactly.
Thanks for your presentation. I have a question regarding basically the destruction of the existing barracks. What would be the how much waste would be generated by that destruction of the existing barracks, and also what would be the environmental cost of processing that waste? I'm just wondering if the cost of processing wouldn't make retrofitting a better option. And
So I was actually in contact with a construction company, and I got a full bid about how much waste there would be, what would be the cost, and one of the options that we were considering very early on before we had our midterm presentation was complete demo and just working from the ground up and creating just permanent buildings and not these new expeditionary houses or housing options. And so right now, because of how light these structures are, they're meant to be deployed very quickly, essentially on the front. They haven't been used permanently that much. And so, like they said, we're working with the manufacturers, but like how much it would cost total for that whole project of demo and then properly disposing of this waste in a green manner it'd be over $1.5 million for only demolition. And so with that cost in mind, that now puts this project into a different category within the hierarchy of the Army. And so that makes it much less attractive for them. So right now, because the units are so light, we're only actually taking off the top of the barracks right now, and we're leaving the structures completely intact. So waste really is going to be minimal in the whole project.
Actually, I was just going to ask that too. I wondered if you had advised them on how they could repurpose the existing structures, perhaps for warehousing or vehicles or something like that, that wouldn't consume much energy.
One of the issues with the repurposing of the existing buildings is upon our second site visit, we really recognized that there wasn't much to them to be used again. They're basically just aluminum structures, and they're prefabricated aluminum panels that are standing upon concrete foundations. So in reality, the destruction of the aluminum panels themselves is pretty minimal of a endeavor for the Army to undertake. So we weren't really considering it as that much waste for them. But I'm glad you brought the point up, because that's something that we need to consider for next week, our presentation to them, because it makes financial sense to get rid of them, but I'm sure there's different manners that we can use these aluminum panels within the Army themselves. But also another reason that we decided against the retrofit option to avoid waste was the fact that, as Ali mentioned, there really is enough space at Camp Buckner for them to keep these facilities up and running and meet the needs of the camp. So in order for us to sort of find a happy medium, we are keeping the existing foundations as they are, which would really be the most difficult part of demolition, and just removing these aluminum panels. So that's definitely something, though, that we'll consider for next week. So thank you for that question.
I didn't, but I do have a question. What's your sense of whether or not they're going to actually implement all of this?
I mean, we're hopeful that they will at least implement parts of it. Obviously, we can't guarantee that they'll implement everything, but this is a project they've been talking about doing for a while. I don't think they've had any renovations on the site since they first built them in the 60s, so they're pretty worn down as is. So hopefully they will take the recommendation. I don't know how long it would take for them to implement new housing options, but we'll see.
In trying to achieve net zero in building designs, like how did you guys, or how would somebody weigh the costs and benefits of insulation versus renewables, and how do you strike the right balance?
So at this point, we've mostly been focusing on the insulation and making new buildings before we moved on to renewables. I think if you go to the, maybe in the hierarchy, I'm not sure if it was in there, but like one of the last options is new energy. Like we're working on the reduction, so if we have better insulation, we'll be using less energy, and then from there we could implement renewables to source that energy.
So we only recently started looking into actual like renewable or alternatives, and one that we were, and I think it came up on the very last slide, one that we were pretty excited about, given the landscape and like there's a lot of the topography of the land up there. It's really very like rough, and there's a lot of rocks, and obviously it's very expensive to take those out. So we through our TA we came to look at floating solar panels, which I'd never heard of before, and they've only been there've been a couple of large-scale projects in Switzerland and Dubai, obviously, and So there are many benefits to them because, like I said, you don't really have the problem of the land. You don't have to take trees out. The trees don't cover them because they're on a lake. You don't have to, get rid of like rocks or other things. And you save a lot of money through cooling because the water actually cools the system from below. And one of the big expenses, like the operational costs with traditional PV systems, is cooling. So you get rid of all of those expenses through that. And they also help reduce water evaporation. They reduce algae growth and algae blooming. So there's a lot of benefits to them. I couldn't find any negatives. So we're kind of being careful on that, but it's definitely something we want to bring up to them. And, yeah.
So water's on there. Did you guys consider water conservation within these designs? Was that part of what you looked at?
Yeah, so they currently source all of their water consumption from the lake that they have there, but the rigid wall hygiene facilities reuse shower water, and yeah, it works on like reuse of water. So they're already net zero technically because they're sourcing their own water, but then the hygiene facilities would reduce consumption.
Touching on the separate hygiene facilities, did you guys get the chance to talk to cadets and kind of like sound out some of these ideas just to see what it would look like from the user side of things?
That's something that originally our first response was, you want to separate their hygiene facilities from where they live? That seemed crazy to us. And to them, it actually really wasn't that crazy of a notion because of, obviously, they have different outlooks in the Army. But we've actually talked to a few cadets on campus. They were pretty helpful in first establishing the energy consumption per barracks because we asked them, how long are the lights on during the summer? We tried to get a more accurate picture of what actually occurs at Camp Buckner in contrast to what they were telling us happens at Camp Buckner. And the cadets themselves will tell you that they're probably not very happy about it, but it's something that the Army feels will be an option for camaraderie as well, because the way they are looking to design the layout of the camp is to have within each company to be surrounding a hygiene facility. So they're sort of in their own little company pods, which is ideal because as is now, because they don't have that much housing, and also they have an issue dividing women and men within the camping facilities. They sort of have all of the companies split up among the camp, and there isn't that sense of camaraderie and community. So in their eyes, they think that separating the hygiene facilities from where they live will sort of emphasize this community and connection between the different cadets. But we had the exact same response. We imagined leaving in the morning to go shower at a different facility as absolutely insane, and it was something that they didn't even blink their eyes at. So something that they actually suggested, and we didn't really think of from the start.
Is there a last question? Last chance? Okay. Jason, you're getting an 8 today.
I'm on a roll. So this is great from the operations side, but it also seems like a great opportunity for educating the cadets. How much are they thinking about this built environment as a way to educate the cadets about sustainability and these important issues?
I think one of the groups last year actually focused on education on the campus during the year. Yeah, I don't remember what it was called, but they were doing that on the actual camp. So it's something that we want to try to work in with this. And at first, if we were doing the expeditionary units, like with these, like you can put them up in like 6 hours or so and take them back down. So if we were doing temporary housing units, we would have that be a part of it because it's what they'd be doing in the field. But now that we're making them permanent, we won't. But that's something that we're going to hope to work into our final recommendation, but we haven't really gotten to yet.
Okay, so this has been a fascinating array of projects. I think we can all agree. You've all done a great job. I'm just going to say good luck next week because you're going to be facing really tough audiences. And so thank you so much for the warm-up on the questions. And let's everyone enjoy some.